All day long on September the 2nd of 2022, Roy and Holly Bailey were concerned about their neighbor across the street. He was a man by the name of Jeffrey Gehrman. The Baileys and Gehrman had been neighbors for over 20 years, so they had come to know each other's habits. And on the 2nd of September of 2022, the Baileys noticed that Mr. Gehrman's garage door was open and his car was parked in his garage, and that was unusual. They called him, they texted him all day on the 2nd of September, and they didn't get a response. Finally, on the evening of the 2nd, Mr. Bailey went over and just shut the garage for Jeff just to protect his house. But at that time, they still hadn't received any response from their calls or texts. On September the 3rd, still having no response, Roy Bailey walked over to Jeff Gehrman's house and was trying to check on him. He found his neighbor, Jeff Gehrman, on the side of his house. Mr. Gehrman was over 60 years old at the time, and so initially it was thought that maybe he had a medical episode. Soon after, though, it was discovered that he had been murdered. Mr. Gehrman had sharp force injuries to multiple parts of his body, all over. He also, when they found him on September the 3rd, had signs of decomposition, indicating that he had not been killed on the 3rd, but was killed earlier. Investigators assessed the crime scene and took note of several things. One of the things they took note of was that Mr. Gehrman's phone was in his pocket. His car keys were in his pocket as well. His wallet with money was on his person as well, suggesting to investigators that robbery was not a motive in this case. Investigators looked around the surrounding area of where Mr. Gehrman was found, and they noticed damage to the bushes in the area of where the body was. They looked closer and actually saw blood on some of the bushes in the area by Mr. Gehrman's body. And they noticed it on some of the outdoor decorations as well. And they took note of that in their investigation. There appeared to be blood on some of those items. Detectives and crime scene analysts looked inside Mr. Gehrman's house as well. Inside the house, there was no sign of forced entry. There was no sign of struggle. All of his valuables were present inside the house. Oops, let me back up just a little bit. Proceed, Your Honor. Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. As I was saying, detectives and investigators checked the inside of Mr. Gehrman's house. There was no sign of forced entry. All his valuables were present, and there was no indication that anything had been disturbed anywhere in his house. So the scene ends up being kind of that side area of his house, those bushes, and where his body was. And as I discussed before, his car was present in his garage as well. Investigators did find some clues as to a timeline of the last hours of Mr. Gehrman's life. They looked through his trash and they found a receipt that was dated on September the 2nd, and it was a receipt for Roberto's Taco Shop, and the transaction time was 9:03 a.m. So detectives go and pull the video from Roberto's Taco Shop to see if they can find Jeff Gehrman present, and he's alive and well at that time. The video time at Roberto's was incorrect, so they went by the cash register receipt, the transaction time, which was 9:03 a.m. On the 2nd, and they watched, and he bought his food and went back to the car, and it was uneventful. One thing that was lucky for detectives was that the Baileys, the couple that lived across the street from Mr. Gehrman, had a home surveillance system. And one of their cameras actually pointed to the front of Jeff Gehrman's house. So they pull that video and they see a figure come to the side of Mr. Gehrman's house. And the figure, as you saw, is dressed in orange. And that person stays lying in wait for Jeff Gehrman. Mr. Gehrman opens his garage and goes over to that side yard, and he's attacked. After killing Jeff Gehrman, the assailant walks down from the side yard and goes back down Jeff Gehrman's street and just walks away. He's picked up on additional surveillance video a little bit further down the street. And eventually there's surveillance of this individual seen getting into a maroon Yukon Denali SUV. And so police try to collect all available video that is present in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Jeff Gehrman's body was transported for an autopsy at the Clark County Medical Examiner's office. When his body was at the office, the cause of death was determined to be multiple sharp force injuries. A crime scene analyst attended the autopsy and collected fingernail clippings and scrapings from Jeff Gehrman's hands to see if there was foreign DNA present. Those samples were taken to Metro's DNA lab, and foreign DNA was detected in the right fingernail clippings of Jeff Gehrman. There was foreign DNA collected, but no one knew who it belonged to. So the murder happens on September the 2nd. Mr. Gehrman's body is found on September the 3rd. After that, Metro released through their public information officer images of that assailant and of the vehicle. So after Metro released those images to the public, asking for help if anybody recognized the vehicle or anyone recognized the individuals, they get a lot of calls come in. And some of the calls they get are about an individual by the name of Robert Tellis, the defendant. At the time, Mr. Tellis was the elected public administrator for Clark County, and a public administrator, when someone dies, sometimes handles the property and looking for next of kin in order to apportion property after someone's death. And in 2022, Mr. Tellis was running for re-election for his post as the Clark County administrator. And detectives learned that Jeff Gehrman had written a series of unflattering articles about Robert Tellis. In those news stories, Gehrman alleged that Mr. Tellis had engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a coworker. He alleged that he was a bad manager and that he engaged in favoritism and bullying in the workplace. That was the first article. Mr. Gehrman wrote a second article saying that another individual had to be appointed to the public administrator's office in order to take over the management, alleging that Mr. Tellis was a poor manager. Soon after those articles ran in June, Mr. Tellis lost his primary election for public administrator, and Mr. Gehrman wrote about that as well. Mr. Tellis responded to the articles written by Mr. Gehrman and claimed they were politically motivated, that they were unfair, and he generally disputed what was alleged in those articles. And following this post by Robert Tellis, Jeff Gehrman wrote another article about Robert Tellis, alleging many of the things that I had previously discussed. Mr. Tellis also engaged in I guess, saying unfavorable things about Mr. Gehrman on Twitter. He accused Mr. Gehrman of going through his trash. He accused Mr. Gehrman of being a bully. He accused Mr. Gehrman of threatening him, all over Twitter, which I guess is now X. Meanwhile, the police do more investigation, and they learn that the Tellis family has a maroon Yukon Denali SUV. And that is important, obviously, because that is seen in the video connected to the assailant. So the search for video, where it sort of started in Gehrman's neighborhood, now focuses kind of on the areas in between Tellis's neighborhood and Gehrman's neighborhood. And this is not just like, hey, is there any video out there? They really look for video. They have a grid, they assign officers, and everybody is looking for any video of this SUV between the two residences. Now, the police still had their timeline where they could go back, and they knew that Jeff Gehrman was alive and well at 9:03 a.m. on the 2nd. And they map out the route between Robert Tellis's house and Jeff Gehrman's house. Now, Mr. Tellis lives on a street called Spanish Steps, and to get out of his neighborhood, you go down a street called Silk Tassel, and then you can turn on a street called Red Hills Road. And on the morning of the murder of September the 2nd, officers found video of Mr. Tellis's SUV leaving his neighborhood on the morning of the murder. To give you some reference point, Mr. Gehrman's residence, as I said, is on Bronze Circle. Streets in his area include Wintergreen Drive and Rock Springs Drive, and detectives go all over that area to see if there's any video that they can find of that Yukon in the neighborhood. And they find on the morning of the murder that that Yukon was present on Rock Springs Drive, and they collect that video. Again, the cross street for Bronze Circle, Mr. Gehrman Street, is Wintergreen Drive. They collect video from Wintergreen Drive as well, and they see the red SUV or maroon SUV in the area as well. They see that maroon SUV interact with kind of workers at a construction site. And the SUV does not go in a direct linear line anywhere. It's picked up on cameras at different times in the area of Jeff Gehrman's neighborhood. One of the cameras picks up the driver of the SUV. You can kind of see that orange clothing, and it appears that the driver is the only one present. At some point, the cameras in that neighborhood pick up this individual getting out of the car. And the individual is seen on Wintergreen, walking past Bronze Circle, going south on Wintergreen, going north, kind of meandering around the neighborhood near Jeff Gehrman's house. Ultimately, the individual is seen traveling in the direction of Jeff Gehrman's house on Bronze Circle, going further towards Gehrman's house on Bronze Circle, and then ultimately to the side of the house. And then in sequence, after the assailant goes to the side of the house, that's when Mr. Gehrman opens his garage door. He goes to the side and he's attacked. The assailant leaves Mr. Gehrman there in the rocks, has his bag with him, and walks down the street. He goes further down the street toward Wintergreen, and he ultimately goes back to that maroon SUV. That maroon SUV, though, then proceeds south on Wintergreen, and it actually heads back in the direction of Gehrman's house. And you can kind of see it parked in front. The individual gets out, goes back towards where the body is. And then the individual returns back to the Yukon. The Yukon leaves Bronze Circle, the cul-de-sac for Jeff Gehrman. It goes back on Wintergreen Drive. It goes west on Washington. It goes on Rampart, goes on Apple, and it goes back to Silk Tassel and Mr. Tellis's neighborhood. So with this video evidence and the evidence of the conflict between Mr. Gehrman and Mr. Tellis, the police seek a search warrant on September the 7th, and they want to get a DNA sample from Mr. Tellis. They want to seize his phone, and they also want to search his house. On September 7th, the police make contact with Mr. Tellis, and they photograph him all over. In particular, they photograph his hands, and they notice on one of his fingers, he has a Band-Aid. They ask him to remove that Band-Aid, and he has a cut injury on one of his fingers. While detectives are photographing and getting that DNA sample from Mr. Tellis, other detectives go to Mr. Tellis's house and execute a search warrant there. So they go to the house that very same day on September the 7th, and some of the detectives are looking through the living room area of the house, and they're kind of focused on the end of the couch, sort of underneath. They see a shoe, and there's actually a Ziploc bag on the right side of the photo. They examine the shoe. They find the companion shoe, but that shoe has been cut in half and sort of destroyed. And the bag, that baggie that was underneath that couch, actually contains pieces of the shoe as well. So they collect that evidence. And the reason why that was important for them is they compared it to the shoes worn by that assailant on Bronze Circle on September the 2nd. They don't just search in the house, they search in the garage as well. And there's a gray kind of tub in the garage that sort of stores stuff. And they take a closer look, and they look at that bag there, and they photograph it and impound it. And they believe the bag is significant in their search because the assailant was carrying a bag that's exactly like the one they found in Mr. Tellis's house. So they find the shoes, they find the bag. they do a search in this garage, which is quite crowded with stuff. And on this, at the bottom of this red tool cabinet, they find a bag from, like a grocery bag from Sprouts. And inside that bag, they find a hat that has been cut up as well. And the hat, of course, is significant because it has the same identifying characteristics as the hat worn by the assailant. So this is all happening on September the 7th. Detectives return Mr. Tellis back to his house on September the 7th, and they actually rush to process his DNA sample that same day. And it's determined that that foreign DNA that was found in those fingernail clippings taken from autopsy of Jeff Garriman, that foreign DNA is consistent with Robert Tellis. So they go back to his residence with the intent of taking him into custody for the murder of Jeff Garriman. And they come to find eventually that he has inflicted injuries on himself, a suicide attempt, and they have to transport him to the hospital for treatment, but he is taken into custody. After that occurs, remember how I said that they took his phone as well? They're able to see some of the messages that occurred between Jeff Garriman and Robert Tellis. One of those messages is from Mr. Garriman on May the 10th. You can see it at the bottom of 2022, where Mr. Garriman says, "Hi, this is Jeff Garriman from the Review Journal. I'm putting together a story on your office. I've talked to several employees who have said you have created a hostile work environment. They also say you've had an inappropriate relationship with one of your staffers, and I very much wanted to talk to you and sort of get your side of the story." After that message was sent, Robert Tellis actually does agree to be interviewed by Jeff Garriman, and he invites him to the public administrator's office, and he sits down with him for an interview. And this is the story that ran digitally for the Review Journal.
The Clark County Public Administrator's Office has been mired in turmoil and internal dissension for 2 years, with workers claiming emotional stress, bullying, and favoritism. Robert Tellis, who leads the office, has also faced allegations of an inappropriate relationship with a coworker, Roberta Lee Kennett. In an interview with Review Journal investigative reporter Jeff Garriman, Tellis disputed several complaints.
What is your reaction to the allegations from these employees that you have created a hostile environment in this office?
You know, I earlier introduced you to the other 7 team members, and they're folks who all come with a great attitude, and they work hard. And together, them and I, we are what is making the difference with the performance of this office. I've done my best to try to make everyone happy, but again, it's got to be within a certain framework. And people just cannot get to do whatever they want, you know. And it's unfortunate that, you know, we have some people who were here from before who were basically trying to railroad me. And again, you meet those other folks, you know, they're happy, they're dedicated, and we're just here to do a good job.
Tellis, who's up for re-election in the June primary, blames a handful of old-timers for claims about a hostile environment in the office.
And again, no matter what type of gestures I try to make to smooth things over, to make sure that they're happy, you know, they just don't, you know, it's nonstop. And again, like I said, it's hard for me to make sure that I am a cheerleader for the folks who are doing really good work when I've got these other folks who are constantly, you know, surveilling me, constantly trying to sabotage the office. But, you know, we're doing it, but it's hard.
Tellis denied allegations of any improper relationship with Lee Kennett.
And when you hear people raising these allegations about you and quote, you know, personal relationship that you have, what do you say to people about that?
Honestly, it's not true. Like I said, which I love my wife. And if you look at, obviously you can't talk to people that do it on a daily basis, but from my social media, from everything, you can see that I am about nothing but justice, fairness, and just being a good person. And it sadly me, it destroys me that somebody would even level like accusations like that, because I don't know, it's unreal. It's unreal the lengths that they're going to. They don't have any qualms trying to ruin my personal life to win this race.
The digital version also included a link with some video of Mr. Tellis and the alleged, the person he was allegedly having an inappropriate relationship with. So after this story ran, Mr. Tellis contacts Jeff Gehrman, and he's upset. He tells Mr. Gehrman, I don't know what to say. I told you about how much this has all impacted me. You heard from employees who are being harassed by these people, provided you, I think he means proof here, proof that I was doing my best to actually smooth things over after I had to make hard decisions. Still, you wrote an article that makes me sound like I'm the guilty one. That was not fair and balanced. So what happens after that? Mr. Gehrman contacts Robert Tellis again, and this time the communication is about the county deciding to appoint another person within the public administrator's office to help run things. Mr. Gehrman messages Mr. Tellis, I understand that Mike Murphy has been brought in by the county, hired by the county as a consultant to work in the office with you guys for a while, and I wanted to see if you had any kind of comment about that. Mr. Tellis messages back to Mr. Gehrman, I will be providing it to you this evening. Later on, Mr. Tellis posts that statement that I had shown you earlier, where he says it's politically motivated, none of the allegations are true, this is unfair, I'm being unfairly attacked. All of the things alleged in those articles are false. And what happens after that? Well, Mr. Gehrman writes the story about the consultant being appointed at the public administrator's office.
Hit it!
After those two stories run, Mr. Gehrman contacts Tellis again. He says, I'm putting together another story on your office. This is now in June the 16th. This has to do with the letter you posted on your campaign website addressing the hostile work allegations. Employees view this as a threat of retaliation and have reported it to Human Resources. I'd like to get your comments. And Mr. Tellis responds back, it's fine, at this point they've won, do what you'd like. And of course, after that, Mr. Tellis loses his primary election, so he will no longer be one way or another in, as of 2023, the public administrator. Another thing that detectives found in Mr. Tellis's phone is something associated with like a phone extraction. So when you have a cell phone, it can be downloaded by this program called Celebrite, and it'll download a lot of the data in your phone. And one of the things that was downloaded from Mr. Tellis's phone is files that he accessed on Google Maps, and you can see their thumbnail photos associated with those maps that he downloaded. And it's probably hard to see because they're little, the thumbnails of what that picture, those two pictures are of. But here's a bigger version, and it should look familiar to you because it's the side of Jeff Gehrman's house where Mr. Gehrman's body was ultimately found. And that image was in Mr. Tellis's phone. Detectives also execute a search warrant on the office of Mr. Tellis at the public administrator's office. They search his work computer as well. And in some of the searching on his work computer, they find that he was looking up the make and model associated with Jeff Gehrman's car, which I think is a Honda. So that was found in his work computer as well. And all that, all the articles kind of conclude in like late June of 2022. In July of 2022, Mr. Gehrman does a public records request from the county. And the records request is for more documents and communications from the public administrator's office. And specifically, he's asking for emails between Robert Tellis and an individual by the name of Roberta Lee Kennett. He's asking for all communications and messages on Teams, which is a way, interoffice way of communicating. He's asking for text messages from their cell phones, and he notes, probably as all reporters do, that you're required as a county agency to respond to a public records request. That request takes place again in July of 2022. The county notifies Mr. Tellis that, hey, Mr. Gehrman is requesting additional information from the office, and they're going to work to fulfill that public records request. Mr. Tellis responds to the county that he would like to see whatever is going to be provided in the public records request and asks about how he may be able to do so. And then several weeks pass, and there's another communication from attorneys for the county about the public records request. And if you look at the date and time on this, this is a notification from the DA civil employees about that request on September the 1st of 2022 at 5:45 p.m. So that's about 15 hours before the murder occurs. He gets a notification about Mr. Gehrman's request. On a calendar, there's an email on the 1st at 5:45 p.m. and about 15 hours later, the murder occurs. In the end, this case isn't about politics. It's not about alleged inappropriate relationships. It's not about who's a good boss or who's a good supervisor or favoritism at work. It's just about murder. And at the end of the presentation of the evidence, we'll ask you to hold him responsible for his conduct.